Naustdal, Norway. 990 AD. A boy is 14. He has watched two older brothers carried home wrapped in wool, one missing most of a hand. Tonight he is sharpening a seax by firelight, and he is not afraid. Not performing calm, not afraid. Across the fjord, a Frankish garrison commander writes a letter to his bishop asking for more men because the ones he has keep hesitating at the wrong moment, flinching half a second too long before the shield wall closes. Half a second is the whole battle. The Norse boy doesn't flinch. Neither do most of the men he'll fight beside in 20 years. And the strange part isn't that they were brave. Plenty of men in plenty of armies were brave. The strange part is that an entire culture, independently across 3 centuries and 4 countries, kept producing fighters who behaved as if the fight was already over before it started. Not bravado, a different relationship with the ending entirely. And the last layer, it has nothing to do with courage at all. The Byzantine Empire by the 10th century had 800 years of institutional military theory behind it. Cavalry doctrine inherited from Rome, siege engineering refined against Persia, a professional officer corps that studied alien and onasander the way modern officers study staff college doctrine, the strategikon attributed to the Emperor Maurice absorbing and outthinking Persian cavalry, Avar siege tactics, Arab raiders, centuries of institutional memory on how to manage a soldier's fear so he'd hold formation instead of break it. And still, when a shield wall held by men who didn't hesitate showed up on a frozen riverbank, the Empire's own doctrine counseled avoiding it. Win through maneuver, through patience, through attrition. A head-on collision with a fearless line was a cost the Empire's own theorists didn't think was worth paying. The Norse had no equivalent body of theory, no staff college, no alien, no standing army, no central pay structure, no drill manual passed down through a literate command class. What they had instead was a story about what happens after you die. And that story, it turns out, was doing tactical work that 8 centuries of Roman engineering couldn't replicate. By the 11th century, the Byzantines weren't just avoiding these men, they were paying them. An elite imperial bodyguard recruited specifically from the north, trusted with the emperor's own life over native Greek soldiers. What did the Norse want out of that arrangement? Money, certainly. But also something the sagas keep circling back to. A story worth telling at home. A man who served the emperor in Miklagard and came back with gold rings was a man whose fate had been good. The transaction ran both ways, and only one side fully understood what it was paying for. There's a picture most people carry of the Viking warrior. Screaming, axe raised, half mad with bloodlust, the berserker stereotype lifted wholesale from one paragraph in one saga and stretched across an entire culture for 1,000 years. The funeral evidence says otherwise. Ibn Fadlan watched a Rus chieftain's funeral on the Volga writing around 921 AD, and what he recorded wasn't chaos. It was procedure, a specific order of events, a girl who volunteered, a ship prepared with method, not hysteria. A practical handbook, the kind written by a man who'd spent decades commanding a Roman army, would have recognized that discipline immediately. It's the same quality his own treatise spent 11 books trying to instill in cavalry through drill and structure. The Norse seem to have arrived at it through something else entirely. The answer isn't one solution. It's a system, and each layer is more deliberate than the last. A midwife hands a newborn boy to his exhausted mother. She traces the infant's jawline with her thumb, feels the pulse in his throat, whispers the truth into the frigid room. The length of this child's life, down to the final breath, has already been spun, cut, and measured by the Norns. No room for negotiation, no room for bargaining later. Örlög, not fate in the soft, modern sense, not things happen for a reason. Closer to a verdict already entered into the record. Laid down before you were born. Final. A Norse warrior didn't believe he might die in tomorrow's raid. He believed the day of his death had already been decided, long before he picked up a weapon. Tomorrow's outcome wasn't a risk to be managed. It was a fact, not yet revealed. Run that belief through a frightened nervous system and watch what happens to the fear response. Modern combat psychology calls it anticipatory anxiety, the dread that builds before contact, the part that makes hands shake and decisions slow. It's not the moment of violence that breaks most soldiers. It's the waiting, the not knowing. Take away the not knowing, even falsely, even through a story, and you've removed the variable that anxiety needs to operate on. You can be calm about something settled. You cannot be calm about something uncertain. That's the lever. That gets you to a man who doesn't flinch. It doesn't get you to a man who fights. Fatalism alone produces stillness, not aggression. And a man standing motionless in the mud while a cavalry line closes is just as dead as one who panics. Something else had to point him forward. This is where Valhalla goes to work. And Valhalla is the part most people misread completely. Not an afterlife in the religious sense modern audiences assume. A career destination with a job description. Train by day, feast by night, prepare for a war still to come. The official version is a mythological hall full of meat and combat. The functional version is an officer's club, and getting in required a highly public exit interview. A spear tip punches through a Norse fighter's rib cage. He grips the splintered shaft, pulls the iron deeper into his own chest, drives his blade upward into the man who stabbed him. He dies, but he dies correctly, and correctly was the only metric that mattered to the men standing next to him. A straw death, old age, sickness, drowning without a weapon in hand, sent you somewhere unremarkable. A death in battle met without flinching was the only currency that bought entry into the hall. Archaeological digs at Birka and the Oseberg ship burial keep turning up the same pattern. High-status grave goods weren't sentimental. They were public proof that the manner of your death had been logged and graded. Across Sweden, the Gripsholm runestone records a campaign east to the Caspian Sea under Ingvar the far-traveled. Every single man on it died in foreign dirt. The stone doesn't apologize for that. It records that they fell as men, feeding the eagles, and that the record alone secured their families standing back home. That wasn't grief. That was economics. A warrior who died bravely wasn't just earning a seat at Odin's table. He was funding his family's future with his own blood. If this is the kind of detail you come here for, a like takes a second and genuinely helps. And it's worth pausing here because the next layer is the one most accounts of Viking warfare get wrong entirely. Fearlessness gets you a man who charges. It doesn't get you a man who holds, who reads the shield wall, waits for the gap, doesn't break when the man beside him goes down. Those are different problems, and most belief systems that solve the first one fail completely at the second. An old man sits by a hearth fire carving a spoon, refusing to look up. His son has returned from a raid physically intact, having abandoned his shield brother on a foreign beach. The son places a hand on his father's shoulder. The father stands, drops the knife, walks out into the dark without a word. Niðingr. Social death, stripped from the lineage, no share of the winter stores, hunted away from the settlement. The Icelandic Gragas outlines this with terrifying precision. Anyone could kill a declared niðingr with full legal immunity. The fear of erasure was engineered to outweigh the fear of a spear. But the fear didn't actually vanish. It relocated. A Norse fighter wasn't fearless in some pure, frictionless sense. He'd simply moved the fear away from death itself and pointed it at something more useful. Dishonor, abandonment of the line, the wrong kind of ending. Fear redirected with purpose isn't the same animal as fear left to run loose in a frightened body. One produces panic. The other produces discipline that looks from the outside exactly like the absence of fear. Anyone who has served in a unit where standards were enforced by the men standing next to you, not by regulation handed down from above, already understands how brutally efficient that pressure is. Nobody needs to write the rule down. The man on your shield arm already knows. Even that wasn't the whole engine. 30 men on a longship, leather thongs groaning against the tholes, icy spray freezing in their beards. You cannot survive open water with even 3 men refusing to bail. The same men who held the line in Francia were the men who'd already trusted each other not to drown a month earlier. The shield wall didn't start on the battlefield. It started on the bench of a ship long before anyone drew a weapon. Some historians argue this entire framework was largely retroactive, that saga writers composing centuries later in a society already converting to Christianity projected a coherent, fearless warrior ideal backward onto a messier reality. Others point to the consistency across independent sources. Burial archaeology, skaldic verse close to the events themselves, foreign accounts like Ibn Fadlan's, and call it something closer to deliberate cultural engineering, refined across generations the way any working technology gets refined, by repetition, by what survived, by what quietly stopped getting repeated. Accident or design? The comments are open. Here's something that almost never appears in the popular version of this story. And it may be the most counterintuitive layer of all. The Byzantine Empire did not simply notice Norse fighters and move on. They built a permanent institution around them. The Varangian Guard, recruited specifically from the north, trusted with the emperor's own body, given preference over native Byzantine soldiers for the single most sensitive job in the empire. Standing between the emperor and a blade. Think about what that actually required the empire to admit. This was the empire that produced the Strategicon and 3 centuries later, Leo VI's Tactica. 8 centuries of written military theory, a professional officer class, institutional memory stretching back through Rome itself. An empire that did not, as a rule, outsource its core security to foreigners out of admiration. It outsourced it when the math demanded it. The math was behavioral. Leo VI's own doctrine counseled avoiding open battle wherever possible, because a head-on clash with troops who didn't hesitate was a cost his theorists didn't want to absorb if they could avoid it. You don't write that doctrine about an enemy who's merely brave. You write it about an enemy whose hesitation threshold is measurably, reliably lower than your own. And once you've identified that gap, the next move isn't avoidance, it's recruitment. Put the variable that frightens you on your own payroll. That's not a footnote. That's an empire's own internal documentation admitting a performance gap, and then paying to close it with the men who'd built the difference into their belief system before they ever set foot in the city. Step back from the details for a moment. None of it was accidental. Örlög removed the fear of an uncertain ending. Valhalla redirected what remained toward honor instead of survival. The social cost of a bad death enforced the whole system without a single officer giving an order. Each layer covers a gap the one before it couldn't close on its own. Remove anyone, and the others lose most of their force. A man who believes his death is fixed but fears no dishonor still flinches. A man who fears dishonor but believes only in chance still hesitates. Only stacked together do they produce a soldier who decides faster than the men trying to kill him. A modern army builds something close to this through selection, drills, and institutional pay structures. Remove any one layer, and the system fails. The Norse system had no single point of failure because the discipline lived inside the belief itself, not in a chain of command standing over it. That is not primitive superstition. That is elegant engineering. If the question of why an emperor would trust his own life to foreign sword arms over his own trained guard, and what those men actually believed that made them worth that trust, is what brings you here. Subscribing means you'll be here when the next layer of this gets pulled apart. There is more underneath. There always is. The next time you feel your own pulse spike before something uncertain. A decision, a confrontation, a risk with a real cost attached. Consider this. 1,000 years ago, a young man stood in a shield wall on a cold morning, felt his heart do the same thing yours just did, and told himself the ending was already written, felt the fear arrive, watched it have nowhere left to grip. Not through greater force, through deeper understanding.